All right, welcome back. Here with Alexey Tolchinsky, a friend and colleague and collaborator on this paper, Temporal Depth in a Coherent Self and in Depersonalization Theoretical Model. So, go for it.
Well, I'd like to say hello to everyone and thank you for being with us after such a long and fruitful day at 6 p.m. on the East Coast. And I appreciate your interest. And thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Active Inference Institute, for this fantastic symposium. We'll be talking today about this paper on dissociative states, and it's a collective effort. This paper is in peer review right now. Early preprint was posted on the site, and it was work by Michael Levin, Chris Fields, Lancelot da Costa, Rachel Murphy, Daniel, who's here, David Pincus, and myself. And this is the link to the paper if you'd like to take a look at the early preprint. Perhaps some of you would like maybe to get a feel for what we're talking about, and this is not a patient's account. This is a poem from Kurt Weill and his song Pretty Pumpkin. I woke up this morning, didn't recognize the man in the mirror. Then I laughed and I said, "Oh, silly me, that's just me." Then I proceeded to brush some stranger's teeth, but they were my teeth, and I was weightless, just quivering like some leaf come in the window of a restroom. And this poem was cited by Paul Molyneux. He's a specialist on DID in England on the Psychiatry and Psychotherapy podcast. You can also find patient's account on YouTube. I couldn't post the video here for copyright reasons. So dissociations are a spectrum, and they range from mild to severe, transient to chronic. They can be benign and pathological, and certainly they're not a bright line category. The causes vary for them as well. We call it etiology in the clinical world. They can be caused by psychological trauma, neurological conditions, substances, seizures, anesthesia, and different sleep phases. There's a subset of conditions here we call dissociative disorders. Typically, in the history of these patients, we see prolonged elevation of stress accompanied by repeated traumatic experiences in circumstances where they feel there is no escape, typically childhood abuse and neglect. And we call that complex trauma, which has a different presentation than acute trauma. And we'll touch upon why this specific pathway of etiology is important for dissociative disorders. I'd like to say why this matters, what's at stake, what's the motivation for this paper. And we have many authors and they have variable motivations, but I'm a clinician, I see patients all day. And for me, the main reason for that is these conditions are hard to diagnose. Many patients go undiagnosed for a long time. They're very hard to treat, and we're sometimes content with partial results. And the risk of self-harm or suicide is higher for these patients. And there are many, many reasons for that. We think that perhaps one of the reasons is that there is no unified theory of dissociations. We have kind of neurobiological ideas, the cortical limbic inhibition hypothesis. We have psychodynamic ideas. We have attempts to model dissociations from first principles by Anna Sionica and other colleagues. But these different attempts are not tied together, and certainly not tied together with the patient's subjective experiences. So we are trying to make steps in that direction. And we don't claim that we've built a unified theory of dissociations, but what we're doing here is we're focusing on one aspect of dissociations, one focal point, that is a collapse of the temporal depth in any kind of dissociation, regardless of the cause. By temporal depth, we mean how far into the future the person can plan. What we're hoping for is that this focused approach has the potential to allow us to perhaps develop more accurate diagnostic procedures and to possibly help increase efficacy in therapy with full respect to how difficult, complex, and messy this work is. Additional point of convergence is we explore multiple theoretical perspectives in the paper, and they all converge on the same points. And here is the main thesis. The collapse of the temporal depth is necessary and sufficient for the onset of a dissociative episode. So we're going a little bit further than colleagues who already mentioned a relationship between temporal depth and dissociations. Dean and Annes Unica and others, and Carl Friston were saying it's causal, that there is no dissociation without the temporal depth collapse, and the collapse of the temporal depth will reliably lead to a dissociative episode. Further, we are saying that temporal depth collapse can be conceptualized as a common pathway for the onset of dissociative symptoms, regardless of etiology. And finally, we suggest that the focus on restoring the temporal depth can be an effective strategy in therapeutic interventions. One of the theoretical perspectives we explored in the paper is Michael Levin's TAME framework, Technological Approach to Mind Everywhere, which I think is very useful. And unfortunately, I haven't seen many attempts to use it in clinical applications. This is the title and the link to the paper. There's so much in Michael Levin's work that is useful. His paper on cancer, which is based on his experiments, is also one of the inspirations for our paper here. But here's another inspiration. If you dive into Michael Levin's work, you'll probably see what he claims, based on experiments, that all intelligences are collective intelligences. However, at our subjective level, at the level of the conscious mind, we don't feel that way. We perceive unity. All our percepts, sensations, thoughts, feelings come together in a cohesive and coherent whole, a single conscious experience in the here and now. And we will talk about this seeming paradox, if you wish, in our paper. Some of the core tenets of the TAME framework, not all of them, but some key points. Commitment to graduality. There is no bright lines. Michael suggests that intelligence is built gradually and by accumulation of complexity. Material independence. Our model is not based on neurons or central nervous system. Where we'll talk certainly about a subset. I'm a clinician, I work with human beings, so we'll talk about brain-based models, but generally the model applies to synthetic agents and cells that are not neurons. Commitment to empirical research as opposed to just exchange of opinions on the subject. Dynamics. The selves are not fixed, they're malleable and plastic. And selves can be nested and overlapping, cooperating and competing both laterally and across levels. This is an illustration of one of the key concepts in Levin's framework called a light cone. And what you see here depicted is various organisms. In the middle of the slide, you see a tick and a dog, a human being, possible AI, a compound intelligence such as an ant colony, and you see this sort of nested and embedded structure on the picture on the right. And light cone has two dimensions. There's a spatial dimension and on the horizontal plane, and the vertical dimension is temporal. And tick, for example, is not particularly concerned with things happening a mile away. It cannot recall far from the past and plan far into the future, while human beings are capable of planning things until that happen after we die, a living will. And with the use of language and culture and books, we can use things that happened before we were born. So we're capable of huge light cones. And I'm highlighting this word capable of. It doesn't mean that in our wakeful hours and alert hours, we're walking around with a significant light cones. They contract and expand depending on various circumstances, but we're certainly capable of them, while ticks are not. And the vertical dimension of a light cone is exactly what we mentioned before. That is the temporal depth. There is, of course, a perspective on the same thing in FEP, and I like this very succinct phrase by Carl Friston, who said, because consequences follow causes, the generative model acquires a temporal depth. And more formally, some agents are only capable of modeling their immediate environment and live in the here and now, while others are capable of planning actions into the future. And the generative models capable of planning are referred to as temporally deep generative models. So temporal depth under FEP is the length of the temporal horizon that is considered during planning. We're moving on to describing the, if you wish, healthy self. And we do mention that it is a materially independent structure where, in principle, we can talk about the selves of synthetic agents and cell collectives. Selves depend on an organism's ability to infer. And here we will provide a viewpoint on the two clinical terms familiar to clinicians, such as derealization and depersonalization. So the organism's beliefs about the world are the inferences about the external environment, and the continuum of issues in this process we will call derealization, while the organism's beliefs about its own internal milieu, its body and mind, we will call the self, and the continuum of issues of this process we will call depersonalization. The selves are hierarchical, composite, nested, and with boundaries. So we consider a self to be a system consisting of hierarchically structured beliefs, which effectively makes it a dynamic hierarchical generative model. And taken in its entirety, the self is informationally separated from the external environment by a Markov blanket or a near Markov blanket by a boundary. We'd like to emphasize, I apologize if this is trivial to the audience of the Active Inference Institute, that this boundary is not material like skin, it is informational, through which the self and not self interact. So to emphasize, the self, as we have defined it, is a model. It is not an organism. The organism constructs and implements it. So the self is quite literally the construction of the mind. This is an illustration of that from early work by Michael Levin. I think this was his doctoral dissertation materials. And what you see here is duck embryos that started from an oocyte, and then you have blastoderm. After cell division, you have a collection of cells. And at the top left, if nothing is done, then this blastoderm will develop into a single ducky. You see this green shrimpy-looking thing? That's a single duck. However, if you introduce a scratch in this blastoderm and the wound heals, the same exact cell collective may develop into twins or triplets. You see the red, yellow, and green duckies. Now think about that for a moment. What happened here? This collective of cells computed what is me and what is not me. And the hardware did not change. But in one case, it made a decision that this is all me and the rest of it is not me. And another one, it says there's three me's. So you can see that this is not hardware. Selves are also, as I mentioned, hierarchical, composite, nested, and they have boundaries. So now we're moving on to components of the self that are, each component is separated by their own boundary, a Markov blanket. And because we're using the word hierarchical, we will define that there is a core self, a core component. If you'd like a visual metaphor that Mark Solms uses, we can think about an onion. And there's different levels of the layers of the onion, and there's a core in the middle. We will talk about that as applied to humans and mammals and rodents. So now we are in organic organisms. This term is from Effective Neuroscience from Jaak Panksepp and Lucy Biven's book. And also, I believe Solms and Turnbull used it. So core self is non-reflexive and dominated by raw feelings and part of purely affective core form of consciousness. So the effective homeostatic mechanisms allow an animal to problem solve in novel environments. And I'll give you an illustration from Mark Solms to maybe just bring it home. Imagine that I'm in the room full of carbon monoxide, and I've never been in that before. So I don't really know what to do, but I feel badly. I feel badly in a very specific way. There's air hunger, suffocation, distress. And let's say I'm moving around the room, but if I move to the left and I feel a little bit better, and that's information. And if I move to the right and I feel worse, that's also information. Perhaps there's a door on the left and there's a draft underneath the door and I feel better. So this compass, this internal mechanism, the homeostatic mechanism, allowed me to find out a possible solution. And we have a whole collection of these, to mention, the actual hunger for food and thirst and social homeostats such as rage and fear and panic, separation, distress, etc. So the collection of that is what Panksepp and Solms conceptualize as the core self. Therefore, the set of predictions in the core self that all the life-sustaining affects will be at or near their settling points, which means, in emotional terms, contentment. All my needs are met. I am A-okay, thank you very much, right? And that is the minimum of the variational free energy. If there are deviations from it, such as hunger or thirst or air hunger, then that would be a prediction error accompanied by a negative feeling, like in the example that I used above. In mammals, we're not putting the equal sign, but we're describing the anatomical structures that are participating in serving this function. We're talking about the upper brainstem regions, including the reticular activating system and the periaqueductal gray. They mediate the functioning of the core self. And you can see a lot more details in Mark's book, Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness. So, core self is thought to be present in animals without the cortex, such as decorticated cats, that are actually more affective and not less. And the cases of human children born without a cortex, hydrancephalic children, they have emotions when, you put a brother on the girl's, chest, she smiles and she cries. So the core self does not require a functional neocortex. The higher levels of the brain structures in humans, including the cortex, mediate the higher levels of both consciousness and the self, and sometimes it's referred to as extended consciousness, which allows us to reflect on what's going on, such as to say, I feel anxious right now. There is an asymmetry in this model where the higher levels, the peripheral levels of the self and consciousness cannot exist without the core. While the reverse is not true. The core can't exist without the higher levels. One of the other illustrations of that, which Solm cites, this is based on Fisher's work in 2016, is that a tiny lesion, a 2 cubic millimeter lesion in a parabrachial nucleus, will reliably and irreversibly reduce a coma. The patient will never become conscious ever again, while you will never have anything like that happen in the cortex. This small lesion in the cortex will not result in catastrophic outcomes like that. And this is one of the reasons why neurosurgeons don't usually like to operate around the brainstem. This is too consequential, too risky. So everything was said about consciousness, the core and extended, is applied to self as well. That peripheral self components cannot function without the operational core self. And we will illustrate that with specific examples in humans later on. In addition to this on-off, where the thing is completely operational or not, we can talk about the influence, and the core self has the ability to change the regime of functioning in other, more peripheral self components by inducing phase transitions in them. And the brain mechanism for that is generalized arousal. When the higher levels of consciousness are present and functional, then we have representations such as fruit and vegetables. And, in the core self, we have raw affects such as, separation distress or hunger. But with the higher levels of consciousness presence, we are capable of thinking things like, I want an apple. Or the affect, the drive, as in Freudian language and in Solm's language, is attached to the object. And similarly, we can have these constructions about the meta objects, such as I look pale, or I am a pessimist, and I here is a mental object. And therefore, I is a metacognitive construct, an abstraction, and it only exists at the higher levels of the self, such as autobiographical self. It is not used or even needed in the core self. To reiterate, core self as a system has the capacity to detect the effective prediction errors and attempt to minimize the variational free energy through action without any I. And we're moving on to peripheral self components, and we'll describe only a few. And the terminology here is different from what you may read in a wonderful book by Neil Seth, Being You. So the first one is autobiographical self, and that's a system dynamically representing our life's history. If you, for example, remember your 10th birthday, and the cake is on the table, and mom is there, and your friends are there, and the sun is shining, and everyone's smiling, and it's Tuesday, that's an episode. That's an episodic memory. And a collection of them organized through time is our sort of life narrative. There is a bodily self, which is a system dynamically building inferences about our body and various representations and interoceptive processing. There's a social self, which is a system representing inferences about how we're seen by others and how we present ourselves and act in the social environment. Each peripheral self component, such as bodily self, for example, has its own Markov blanket, And each component is embedded into the whole self and also contains subcomponents, creating a nested architecture that you saw in the TAME light cone picture before. About the unity, that in humans, at the higher levels of the self, such as at the autobiographical self level, these levels create an impression of a unified experience, and this is just the experience of the autobiographical self, not the entire system. The autobiographical self claims to itself and others to be the entire self, while it is not. So Anil Seth refers to these things as delusion. We have a delusion of being a unified, I don't know, Alexey, right? But what we're saying is that it is that system that is deluded, the autobiographical self subsystem. I'm ambivalent about using the term deluded. I think it's not the optimal one because we use it in the clinical world, and I prefer it called inference or belief that we're unified. Stated differently, we can say that a stable belief that I'm whole in the I'm complete in the autobiographical self. Its generative model contributes to us feeling as a monadic self. Therefore, the subjectively perceived unity, the coherence of the self, is an inference. Related to coherence, another thing we can talk about is continuity. And nearly as a tautology stemming from the definition of Markov blanket, our self remain the same, persist in time, while all the processes or communications across its Markov blanket remain functional. And we can offer you another viewpoint on the same exact phenomenon from, if you wish, more neurobiological perspective or psychological perspective. If you recall, maybe you're at the train station or anywhere in the city and you see someone and you think you recognize them, but you're not sure. This sensation of recognition of familiar, so the familiarity novelty calculations is what we're talking about here. And depersonalization is a breakdown in that. Something that is familiar myself suddenly, abruptly becomes very novel and not recognized. But actually, these calculations neurobiologically are not bright line dichotomous categories. They are probabilistic and they are spectrum, but we coarse grain them in the mind often into yes or no, familiar or novel. So that subjective impression of yes, I know this person or not is just the coarse graining of the continuous variable. Representational capacity is important. The deep generative model implies that the agent is capable of planning into the future, which in turn requires an ability to generate, store, and retrieve counterfactual data. Generate, store, and retrieve is memory. So therefore, when the representational capacity is completely or partially impaired for any reason, the agent completely or partially loses an ability to infer, leading to depersonalization and derealization. If we talk about health and pathology briefly, the two key terms here are voluntary and involuntary. Again, all of us during our day, we can either sit down to plan things, for 10-year temporal horizon, which expands our temporal depth, or when we meditate or rock climb, then we can be more in the moment, in the here and now. But trauma doesn't ask permission. Perpetrators are, there's nothing voluntary about it. And so that's an involuntary collapse of the temporal depth, which usually is leading to pathological conditions. This is a perspective from the nonlinear dynamical systems. If again, I am in, adult, healthy, alert functioning, and I may have small deviations from I am me, say I'm daydreaming or something like that. And the collection of these points from which I reliably return to I am me can be described as the attractor basin, and the whole thing in terms of attractor landscape is the set point attractor regime, I am me. And I am me would be the variational free energy minimum. And that is a fairly stable system, perhaps in the autobiographical self, right? Now, in order for that system to change, some energy needs to be applied. And with external interference of sufficient power, this attractor landscape can change. When that power is applied, temporarily there's a phase transition. The attractor landscape evolves into something else. Perhaps during that transition, you have a chaotic regime. And if we are in the case of trauma, then the functioning can be chaotic for a while, but then it may settle down, so to speak, into one of the possible post-traumatic presentations. There may be multiple post-traumatic presentations. And one of the possible options is depicted here. This is not, again, universal, but it's one of the possible options. What you see here is a multiple coexisting point attractors represented by local minima of the variational free energy. And they can correspond to alters in the ID. And in this example, you also see that they're surrounded by a global minimum of variational free energy. Now, also, if you look at the area, the region between the local minima, then in dynamical systems, that's called a repeller. And repellers are notoriously chaotic, so that suggests that you may not have very good predictability of how you will transition from alter X to alter Y or alter Z. To say a few more words about this, when we switch between the alters, then we are in regime of itinerancy. This is the term Carl Friston likes to use a lot, and justifiably so. Also, when we have these transitions from X, alter X to Y, that the time is disrupted. In the idea, you don't have this flowing continuity of time. There's a series of disruptions. Effectively, then your coherent large light cone is broken into pieces here. Now, imagine that this patient with this condition reached out for help and they want to get better. But this attractor landscape already acquired some stability. And so, again, we need some interference to destabilize the pathological regime. The difference here would be that in therapy, in the process of healing, this destabilization of the pathological attractor landscape is voluntary, controlled, and guided, ideally by a licensed and competent mental health professional. And that's the difference from the onset of acute trauma. So psychotherapy can be one such intervention, and it's the treatment of choice. We have very limited efficacy with medications, and now it's very fashionable to talk about augmentation with psychedelic treatment or perhaps neurostimulation. It's important to say that just destabilizing that landscape doesn't guarantee anything at all. So when people present this idea that you just go to, and have some ayahuasca or anything, ketamine infusion, and you're better, is a myth. Because, the important part is that the patient settles back into health, and just the destabilization of this landscape doesn't lead to that. You still need therapy. You still need, to process the trauma, not just to destabilize the pathological regime. And that therapeutic process, when you destabilize the pathological attractor landscape, is another phase transition, temporarily chaotic, with the idea that eventually it leads you to a healthier functioning, either a attractor landscape corresponding to cohesive system, or at least a little more coherent system with less alters, partial improvement. Let's talk a little bit more about the phase transition. So before things happen in health, we have a nested and embedded self, and that can be described in FEP as a hierarchy of coupled interconnected attractors. Carl Friston, wrote that slower attractor can possibly control the phase transition of the faster attractor. And in our system, the core self is feeling-based, it's affective, and it's one of the components of affects of feelings is generalized arousal. And we know that the changes in generalized arousal level can lead to the phase transitions of the entire neocortex from periodic to chaotic state and back. So this is one of the possible explanations in our model how this works, the phase transitions. A few more thoughts about it. Trauma is not a guided transition. It's an effective storm. It's a flood of cortisol that is abrupt and severe, and that abrupt increase in generalized arousal leading to the destabilization of a healthy attractor landscape in the autobiographical self. But then when there's an onset of a dissociative syndrome after trauma, then the regime settles down to a lower energy, perhaps affective numbness that patients talk about. And in a psychotherapy, not immediately, but when the patient is ready, which can take a year or more, when there's active trauma work, then there is again an increase in energy level with the idea eventually to settle down to a healthier regime of functioning. A few clinical observations starting from dissociative disorders, which are conceptualized traditionally as defensive response to prolonged and inescapable trauma. Clinicians talk about, and patients report this quality of emotional flatness or deadness or numbing. Sometimes they call it freeze. So in our model, it corresponds to issues with communications between the core self and the peripheral self components. For example, that autobiographical self in this regime operates as if it is uninformed by the vital emotional informational flows that originate in the core self. One of the possible ways it can be achieved, not the only way, but one of them is the prefrontal cortex inhibiting the limbic structures. That's the cortical limbic inhibition hypothesis. And in FEP terms, that means lowering of precision associated with effective prediction error messages. We're moving on to also severe dissociations, but temporary, such as general anesthesia, propofol. And it's a very profound change in the body that influences the gap junctions between the cells. And recovery from anesthesia is a very interesting process. Michael Levin is fascinated with it. It's actually a little bit of a miracle that we come back to be the same person we have been before. And some people don't. You may wake up a pirate. And these conditions are called postoperative delirium, dissociative amnesia, postoperative cognitive dysfunction. This is also an illustration that self is computed and plastic and malleable. It's not a hard, hardware. And perhaps we get oriented with the use of our memory systems, including the episodic memories. Another severe case is a seizure, where not only autobiographical self is impaired, but also the social and the bodily self. And one of the reasons for that is the necessary resources for the functioning of these self components are not operational in seizure. Moderate dissociations in neurological cases, but permanent ones, are, for example, perhaps one of the most famous neurological patients, HM, who had a bilateral hippocampus damage. And in Britain, there's Clive Waring, and Anil Seth describes Clive Waring in his book, Being You. These patients do not have episodic memory encoding, and effectively they live in about 10 minutes of the here and now. There is no past and no future beyond that. And if you read Clive Waring's diaries, that he talks about the series of awakenings. He said, "Oh, I just woke up." And 10 minutes later, "Oh, I woke up." And then I woke up. And if you show these diaries to a clinician who's an expert in DID, they will, which I've done, I talked to Roxy Wolf, one of the fellows of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociations, and she said that, this patient looks perpetually depersonalized. There is no continuity in self. Korsakoff patients, they don't recall the past, they confabulate the past. And in Alzheimer's in early phases, there's issue with recent autobiographical memories, but some access to the remote autobiographical memories. All of these cases are discontinuity in autobiographical self. More frequent, perhaps, cases are substances. Ketamine, high doses of THC or ayahuasca lead to depersonalization and derealization. And importantly, if you read the studies, then these patients actually report, they tell you that their sense of time is impaired. Not only that, the planning is impaired as well. If you have a alcohol blackout and the person tells you on Wednesday that they have no idea whatsoever what happened on Tuesday after 6, then this is a discontinuity, this is a gap in episodic memory. There's also something called traumatic amnesia. There's very sad cases of high school shootings where, the person literally doesn't remember, 15 minutes of what was happening in the cafeteria. What happens in acute PTSD is that, hippocampus is reaching cortisol receptors and there's a flood of cortisol. And effectively, the episodic memory of trauma, the cohesive contextual timestamp memory is not laid down in a stable fashion. You have shards of glass, you have phobic memories, semantic memories, procedural memories, but not the episodic one, which is also discontinuity in autobiographical self, and that is involuntary. And we talked about mild, benign, everyday dissociations. Next time you wake up, maybe tomorrow or the day after, try to monitor what's going on. And you may catch that phase of what Metzinger calls, a non-egoic self, where things are just flowing through your mind. but your eye is not fully on board just yet. To summarize, the level of consciousness, regime of consciousness, pathological states, and all the underlying resources necessary for the successful operation of each self-component collectively influence the complex dynamics of the system. A neurobiological perspective, briefly, the historically most famous one is cortical limbic inhibition hypothesis by Sierra and Berrios, who postulated that prefrontal cortex is inhibiting the limbic structures, including the amygdala and the anterior cingulate cortex, ACC. The subsequent studies don't fully support that hypothesis, but partially support it. I like the work by Ruth Lanius and her colleagues. And guess what? Her revision, her refinement of the cortical limbic inhibition adds dynamics, transience, context, and itinerancy. All the things we like. They talk about two regimes, even in patients with dissociative syndromes, overmodulation and undermodulation. Again, itinerancy, not one regime, but multiple regimes. Overmodulation is indeed hypoactive amygdala and hyperactive prefrontal cortex, which is described above. But also these patients less frequently, but you can see it, are in a reverse regime where amygdala is active and PFC is less active. Overmodulation dominates in dissociative conditions. They refined the anatomical network and talked about different subregions of amygdala, the central medial amygdala, basolateral amygdala, dorsolateral periaqueductal gray, ventrolateral periaqueductal gray, thalamus, and other regions. And this network of regions collectively works to create specific post-traumatic regimes. They also described that regime where patient has access to painful memories usually is accompanied by undermodulation, very active state with amygdala active. And when they don't have access to painful memories, they're more in a dissociative state. We can also briefly talk about what are the anatomical substrates and the neuropsychological substrates of the temporal depth collapse. And again, acute trauma, hippocampal damage, and dementia affect the episodic memory system. If there's an insula damage, then you can expect the disruption in the bodily memories. And perhaps in ketamine use, you may have a dysfunction of prefrontal cortex and frontoparietal network, which renders the working memory of the patient dysfunctional. You can imagine other circumstances when you have PFC and frontoparietal network impaired. That usually leads to a psychotic state where, it's very hard to think. We need working memory to be able to think. About dissociative disorders, again, the point made at the very beginning that prolonged, inescapable exposure to highly stressful environments can be seen as lasting stress beyond the agent's ability to manage, which results in the breakdown of TAME light cone into the components, fragmentation, decoherence, and discontinuity when the landscape, attractor and repeller landscape corresponding to a pathological condition takes root. And in contrast to that, if you look at the single episode of ketamine intoxication, then you have transient working memory disruption leading to transient dissociation. Again, to summarize, lasting or temporary, severe or mild, dissociative experiences are accompanied by the collapse of the self's temporal depth. And we are ready for a discussion, which I very much look forward to.
Thank you, Alexey. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Okay. Where should we begin? What would be interesting or given where the work has gotten over the last few weeks, what do you feel like is most relevant?
Well, perhaps any colleagues have comments. I don't know if Jesus is with us, and he's an esteemed neuropsychiatrist, and he sees a lot of patients and perhaps neurological patients, and he can comment on some of the things we've mentioned. I had a clinical meeting with colleagues who do a lot of dissociative works, and I'm seeking feedback and critique, and so whatever people have, whatever thoughts people have. Yeah.
If there's anyone in the live chat, they can write a question. A few pieces that stuck out differently in how you presented it in comparison from working on the paper was the narrative self's role in the maintenance of the narrative of unity and about what is the experiencer of that, or is that all it can do? Why does it do that? Why does the autobiographical self have that kind of a voice or a cognitive function?
Yeah. Is audio working okay?
Yeah.
Can we hear each other? I think why is a tricky question. It might also be a teleological question. I would say that it's probably functional, for us to have coherent selves. And I don't know why, but mm, we are observing it. So we have descriptive level, we have observations that I feel like the same Alexey. And it's a little bit of a miracle that, as we know, that the cells in the organisms, they die and they're born, but I still feel like the same person. Even so, we change developmentally. I'm not the same person as I have been at age 5 or age 15, but I still maintain this story, if you wish, this belief that I am the same. And I also protect the internal milieu from external threats, of the same organism. And if we look at other species, say an oak tree that, grows from an acorn, it is still the same oak. It's the same organism. I perhaps in biology as well, there's a need for the system inside the Markov blanket to maintain that, saying whatever is inside the Markov blanket is the same me. But it is a belief, and um, I don't know if I'm answering your question. Maybe I'm just free associating to it. So, yeah.
Is that a clinically valid method? Well, it reminds me of mortal computing, and there's a lot of focus on how behavioral activities in a niche relate to the material stability. And I think you really drew carefully on Mike Levin et al.'s work to talk about the analogous dynamics on a landscape of a narrative self. And that's just that was like a trampoline. But then you also complicated that with multiple selves, like the social and the narrative. And so then there are these multiple dissociative, or like it's they each have their own unity, and yet
Yes.
they can be discordant and unified.
Yes.
And so then is there any general framework for different possibilities open-endedly of different regimes?
These are great questions, or even maybe challenges to develop it further. But I agree with you. If we look in the bodily self, right, I don't perceive my hand to be a separate entity. I feel for it to be part of the whole organism, myself, my body, right? And so in the bodily self, there's also a level of unity. I'm just saying that this is again a computation within that specific subsystem that my body is one whole self. And we can see how that gets perhaps distorted in somatoparaphrenia or even rubber-handed illusion where this hand is perceived as not, and so we see that the system is plastic and malleable and prone to change, but when no interference is happening, it continues to be cohesive as one body and one mind, this autobiographical. I've noticed you use the term narrative self. I think that's Anil Seth's term. And I prefer autobiographical for the reason that rats, they have episodic memories and they don't have our verbal abilities. And so they also have episodic memories, which are what, where, when, the contextual memories, right? And I think that there's the same I in all autobiographical memories, and that's the unity. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, a few comments. It probably is more accurate to say it's a narrative cognitive capacity that encompasses autobiographical or allobiographical type narratives. And I'm reminded of NPR radio discussion from a few days ago that I listened about memoir. and about what memoir was, and could it only be written when the person did or didn't change a lot, but what or who doesn't change in every single one of these ways. So then what would that mean? Like what? So that was kind of a funny connection. And then do you have any thoughts on that, or have another active comment?
No, I'm just enjoying your comment. I don't know if I have a thought on that. Yeah.
You see many clinical memoirs and presentations of self understandings and all of this. So there's just so many, and it gets brought out so sparsely, like, and indirectly. And it makes a lot of sense to the person who might be saying it, but that you could be too or not confident enough about that.
Interesting you brought it up. Thank you for that, Daniel. I think that, when we theorize, say dynamic theories, then we usually think about different sub-agencies of the mind. Like Freud, for example, in his, structural model, he had the id, ego, and superego, where I want pistachio ice cream is the id, and pistachio ice cream is fat and calories, that's the superego response, and pistachio ice cream is $4 and you have 3.5 is the ego. But there's a whole bunch of them. We can name a sort of sub-agency of an internal judge, which is sort of super egoish, or a neutral observer, or an accountant who's running a tally, and all of this. So we all have sort of a jury there of different kind of regimes of operation, if you wish. But the patient is often surprised because when they, for example, self-criticize, and you talk about that in therapy and say, do you notice the voice of your judge? It's kind of, not very fair. I mean, there's no misdemeanor, everything's a felony, and judge is present all the time. And like, no, it's not that. It's me. I'm doing it. I screwed up. So again, the default regime is me, myself, and I, that I am bad. And when we discuss these things and we open it up and we show the different kind of we show a theater with different voices or a jury with different representations. It's usually kind of an insight. It's a surprise, but that allows a bit more control for the patient in the clinical work. So,
Okay, I'll read a question in the live chat. Pablo
sure.
FM wrote, "Thank you very much. I find it super interesting. I wonder why humans seek for drug experiences. Having been so decisive in human history, coffee could be a great example. Tea, tobacco, alcohol have also been very popular among civilizations."
Mm. It's a great question. I don't know if I have a good answer. It's a huge question. And there's a good paper, you can find it on Google Scholar or PubMed, by Maggie Zellner, Mark Soms, and other colleagues. I think Jaak Panksepp was alive. It's called Why Depression Feels Bad and What Do Addicts Really Want? And it's based on effective neuroscience. And what it postulates is that, of course, there are individuals who have multiple drugs that they are, using all the time. So there's an upper and the downer and other things. But there are usually some innate kind of predispositions where people who are wound up and tense, they sometimes crave alcohol because it's binding to the GABA receptors and it's sort of, sedating us a little bit. It makes you a little more less kind of wired up. People who are very painfully lonely and detached, and they crave human comfort and to feel together and loved and accepted. They may, if they discover opioids, that would be a lock and key match. That would be a dangerous combination. And perhaps when somebody is oriented to performance and they're very bored all the time and they want to something, to do better and more, they may gravitate toward stimulants. And so there's these things, and there's some common factors among different agents, such as, I believe that multiple substances, they have the dopaminergic effect. And, a lot of motivations are subjective in individuals. I've had patients say that I'm smoking pot to slow down time. I've had patients tell me that, pot is my oldest friend. I've been doing it longer than any person that I've been with. Some people seek this state of numbness and they want to kind of not feel as acutely. They want to sort of feel desensitized. So these states of dissociation can be desired. And that's briefly, I guess, what I wanted to say about it. So,
Wow, thank you. I'm reminded of a comment from Mao in the live chat earlier this morning, and she was kind of pointing to how one mode of how we've seen active inference applied in these presentations is looking like ethology at the sequences of behavior, but not really looking at the self-maintenance as a behavior. Like, especially talking about digital agents, or it's just about what do they perceive, what do they do, and it's taken as a granted or a separate question how they exist. Yet also there's this self-maintenance, self-reconstruction character that doesn't even need to have anything to do with the ethology. Its dynamics can just be like morphologically playing out, not necessarily doing some cognitive task out in the world in any particularly effective way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a very interesting thought, and for some reason, I'll allow myself the liberty to free associate again. It reminded me of Yuval Harari, who, when interviewed, he said, "You guys go to the gym, you observe your diet, and you take care of your body." And he said, "I take care of my mind. I meditate an hour a day," and he goes to silent retreat a month in a year. And the interviewer challenged him. I think he was from The Daily Show. He said, "How do you manage that?" And Harari said, "I got no kids, you know." So, but in addition to that, he's also in therapy. So there's that idea of really maintaining the mind and not just the body with behaviors. We're all oriented to what do I do, what do I think, which are sort of verbal, virtual behaviors. But how do you feel? As my great colleague Rajiv Warrior says, we're human beings, not human doings. And we have a very tough time being. We're all about doing more. That's right. And so, and also Harari talks about informational hygiene, where a lot of stuff in the social media is noise and trash, and a lot of it is consumed, and we have pollution. But, so he doesn't do, he reads books and he thinks in millennia, but I don't know. I mean, I went sideways from your comment, but that's where my thought went. So.
Yeah, it seemed like a very relevant when people are discussing the unity or the articulation of mind and body, which is kind of what this unified promise on the cover of the textbook suggests, is what would it be to have a unified model of brain, mind, behavior, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then the analogy or the connection with the physical and the cognitive is just, it has to be taken as a starting point, not like a hot take.
Yeah. But what you just said reminded me, when I read Michael Levin's work and got more familiar with it, I actually had regret. I'm like, why were we not taught that? That was a bit of a revolution in my mind. It was a big pivot, because if you go through graduate program in psychology, it's all about the unity. I am the same, cohesive and coherent. And the fact that we have intelligence at the level of individual cells, and then the cell collective, and then tissue and organ, and all of this thing that I think is one monadic Alexey is a pyramid with communications bottom up and top down and laterally, is a revolution, I think, that, I wonder what models of psychology can be built with that, and they don't exist yet. It's all about one big block, and then what happens to it? I am depressed. There's no collectives. This is one big block, right? Yeah.
It's a really important insight. I think that's the kind of frictions and experiences we'll start to learn more about and see produce in different ways. Like just seeing how you connected the topics to specific quotes, translated the ontology, reworded descriptions using kind of like a translation, sometimes really just as simple as a lookup of words, just authors using one word and being able to see an active ontology term equivalent or roughly related. It's and what does that look like? Or I guess as your last comments, what do you think after the paper, after this now? Like, what are the directions towards which people would say, okay, that's applying active inference in a clinical setting?
My goal eventually, I think, is to get to therapeutics. And for example, actually, I probably will not use that example. It's good material for the second paper that we'll follow up with. But I do think that, the question is, what do we do in therapy differently? How do we understand? How do we formulate cases differently with this information? I haven't heard it clearly said out loud in the DID literature. There's a lot of perspectives, there's a lot of endless complexity, and there's a lot of nuance. But if we can highlight a central point and say there is a temporal depth collapse, I think it allows us to do something with it in clinical work and in diagnostic work. And that's my hope. It may not materialize, but this is what I'm hoping for. So,
Well, even from a researcher's ethological perspective, it's kind of like that's the transferable and the interesting research question. How could you be observing not on the inside and make some kind of inference or assessment that would matter clinically with no map territory pretense? Not that it's 100% reliability, just taking a clear look at the diagnostics available, rethinking it from dynamical systems perspective, maybe different biometrics, maybe pupil. It's just kind of, that's the open question. And then where it provides clinical utility, that's where it matters.
mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Perfectly said. Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Thank you, Alexey. See you.
Thank you, Daniel. See you. Bye-bye.